it going? We're waking up. It's the afternoon. It's Friday. You didn't go to work today. Some of you work here. Some of you I made come here because you work with me. But I think we've had a really great set of setup talks. And I should say that what we do at Data and Society, if you haven't seen some of the pamphlets that Audrey so graciously brought, which I had forgotten at the office. We are the Media Manipulation Initiative at Data and Society, and we've been spending a lot of time thinking about all of the ways in which information systems get gamed by all sorts of folks, intentional, unintentional. But what we tend to do is qualitative research where we hang out and we look at trolls, we look at white supremacists, we look at men's rights advocates, we look at state propaganda, we look at celebrity gossip. I mean, it really runs the gamut, because what we're really interested in is how do people use media to manipulate individuals and groups, and then how do individuals and groups use media to persuade public opinion or to manipulate public agendas or to, frankly, mess with journalists? That seems to be a ton of our time is attributed to messing with journalists. So I was really happy to see the range of talks that we have today, because I think they really set us up for a series of 4 guided discussions that we'd like to have with well, we have Josh, which is a guest of honor. And so what I'm going to have each person do to describe some of the breakout topics, let you know who they are, why they've been selected to lead this discussion. I think everybody that's leading a discussion is an expert in their subject area. And so I will hand it over to Josh to go first. So who are you, and why should people want to have this conversation with you?
That's a tall order. But yeah, my name is Josh Hadro. I'm pinch hitting. I don't work for Data and Society. I work for the New York Public Library. I'm the Associate Director of Digital Policy, so I look at a whole range of things, especially as we try and figure out some of this stuff and privacy and implications and all this. I'm also a former journalist, so I've been sort of paying attention to all this for a long time. And I guess my topic here is, I'll read this to you. So I'll work with participants to map the roles librarians can play in leading the charge against disinformation, right? So I'm a librarian. I also teach at Pratt Library School, so that's a related piece. So maybe there's a part of it about how we teach librarians to do this, how basically how we can work professionally to do this, to work with our service communities and all these different things. So it'll be a broad-ranging thing. Hopefully we'll push some bounds and maybe come up with answers and share it back.
Next up, we have Caroline Jack, who I'm sort of lying here. So today's Caroline officially ended work with us yesterday, but was so excited about coming here and being part of this that we welcomed her with open arms. And Caroline is going on to be an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego in their communications department. And so we are excited for your future, but sad to see you go.
Hi, everybody. Well, first, thank you, Joan, for inviting me to be here today. As she mentioned, this was just too good an opportunity to pass up, so I'm so happy to be here. In the breakout session that I'll be leading, it was really just fortuitous that we had some discussion already about like what we imagine propaganda to be. One of the things that I wanted to kind of open the discussion by talking about is some of the kind of 20th century historical ideas of what propaganda is or can be, which range from the negative to, in some cases, the positive and even oriented towards social justice. So using that as a provocation to kind of open up a conversation where there's room to talk about who can commit propaganda. Is it just the state? Is it other kinds of actors as well? What do we call propaganda versus public relations versus grassroots campaigning? To talk about some historical cases in U.S. culture ranging across the 20th century, and to think about how those can help us understand how we encounter mediated persuasion campaigns today.
Very cool. So in group 3, you're going to be guided with me and Matt, who's in the back here, and we're going to talk about jumping out of the meme presentation. We're going to talk about what roles memes are playing in disinformation, how they're so thinking through some of the historical questions about memes. And then I want to learn from you all, how might we archive this? How might we debunk this? How might we do something about the problem? But I also am interested in thinking about dialogue memes, disinformation campaigns, and we really welcome your participation in that. And then lastly, we have Amelia Acker, who is a professor at UT Austin in their iSchool. And she has just joined the media manipulation team today. She went last night. So welcome. You know, one professor out, one professor in. This is how we do it. So I'm really happy that you guys have had some overlap today, and you can talk about your breakout.
Great. So, hi everyone. I'm going to be leading this session on metadata and how we might think about it as a method or a means of tracking information, or misinformation, disinformation, and maybe even propaganda. In my work at the iSchool at UT, I teach metadata, digital preservation, description, and access. And all of us who are librarians and archivists and information professionals know there's lots and lots of different kinds of metadata. We learned about lots of different ways of thinking about metadata and sourcing the information that we're looking at. Ben's talk, we talked about checking out the date of a post. David's talk today, we talked about what did he say? He called it legacy data profiles, I think, which is basically your metadata collected over time, right? Darcy gave us some really interesting stuff about thinking about the structural and technical metadata of misinformation and fake news on platforms. So how do we leverage, the HTML tags of posts to let robots tell us, what is true or a falsehood? So anyway, we're going to be talking about sort of different methods and means for thinking about metadata as a way of understanding misinformation and disinformation. And I'm going to be assisted by Nikki from Berkman Klein Center for Internet Studies and Society, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So thanks. Come join us. Yeah.
Okay, so the way we're going to do this, there's a few different rooms, and so I need to know how large each group's going to be. So if you want to join Josh's group, can you raise your hand so I can... Okay, so that looks good. Let's do that one in the small conference room, which is just outside and to the left. Before you go, we'll get the rest of the groups here. Group number 2 was Caroline's group. Who wants to talk more about propaganda, advertising? Great. Y'all are going to go into the kitchen. Does that make sense? Lucky dogs, with all the coffee. First the party, right? And then Amelia's group on metadata tracking and following up. A few. Okay, great. So that group's going to go into the large conference room, next door to the small conference room, and then the rest of you are here with me, and we'll rearrange the chairs. Awesome. All right, we are reaching the last leg before the party, and if I know anything about people in libraries and information sciences, is y'all know how to program a party. So I'm looking forward to, I see there's some posters being made. There might be some games. I know the snacks are going to be delicious. So, but I don't want to lose the hive mind just yet. I think everybody's had really provocative conversations, have some new ideas. I heard the report backs from the people on that were facilitating said that they felt like you all pushed them in new directions, and they have a lot more to think about. So I was going to hand it off to Josh to just give a quick summary of some of the main points that came out of the discussion about the roles that librarians can play in leading the charge against disinformation.
All right, let me try and stand. Actually, can I put this? No, I'll just stand and hold my computer. All right, so we were the breakout group number 1 in the small conference room that we filled to the gills. We were talking about mapping the role that librarians can play in leading the charge against disinformation, right? And so we sort of took that expansively and we started looking at what we do now, and then I think distilled down to a list of, probably not exhaustive, but a list of things that librarians can do in librarian organizations and going from there. So, one of the simplest and the starting one is individual outreach, or individual instruction and outreach, right? So that's a very common practice. This idea of actually teaching information literacy and all the things that come with that. So whether it's at kind of a school age or college age, or even into kind of continuing education idea. Related to that, and comes with it, is organizational outreach, right? So reaching out to schools, reaching out to civic organizations, governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, local businesses, all different things like that. So working with organizations to help them work with their communities or members or patrons or customers or anything like that, right? To sort of communicate some of these tools and ideas. Another one is just this idea of support, not necessarily instruction, but supporting legitimate news, supporting faculty in their research, supporting teachers, right, in building curricula and things like that. So that was sort of a support role less than instruction. Another one is about deploying collection development efforts, right, or collection development budgets. So this is not necessarily challenging the neutrality idea, but things like making sure, like including ProPublica, right? Organizations that are really actively battling disinformation or trying to be very open journalistic organizations, making sure those are included along with other kind of more traditional publications. Another one is about collective action and lobbying, right? So working with groups like Metro and ALA and ACRL local and all the different ways that we sort of can group our efforts to sort of have a more consolidated voice and make that more powerfully communicated out into the world. We talked about marketing our relevance. Some of the sessions today talked about that, but just connecting to pop culture, right, and current trends in media. So that sort of helps. It goes two ways. It can work into the idea of instruction and literacy, but can also, right, market your organization and your department and things like that as the kind of place that is sort of aware of current trends and is a place to go for information and seeking different connections. Another one, I will say I sort of added this, but I think it came related to some of the things we were discussing, was serving as a moral authority, right? That's maybe the most abstract one, but this idea of people identify librarians as the kind of people who, right, are correct, who like combat fake news, even if that's not necessarily what we all spend our days doing every day. There's something very valuable in that moral authority and presenting that idea, and it can come with certain edges to it, but I think that's an important thing we could keep doing. I think that was the gist of it.
Amazing. Great. Yeah, big ups. Thank you for that group report back. I'm a big fan of moral and technical order. I sort of try to, I always imagine the two going together, right? That is like you can have a good set of morals that guide your principles that then allows you to organize information and knowledge in such a way that you want to be able to reach out to the broadest possible audience. You want to be able to engage different kinds of readers and different ways of seeking and gaining knowledge. And so I am fully on board. And I think that one of the things that we get into when we have this conversation about what counts as neutral is we maybe shift to thinking about partisanship or left versus right, but we should really stick to the true versus false. And when things are demonstrably false, we should just have faith in that we have done the research, we have looked at the source material, and we can make that determination. I think that some of the things that when we get into gray areas about things that are not always true nor false, but do require context and discussion, then we can rely on our best faith effort in thinking morally, but then also understanding that the way that we organize our value systems algorithms don't always have to be left or right. They can also bring in this moral component around when we know things are true or false, or create the context to understand when things are in need of more discussion. So now I want to go to Caroline's group and talk about their conversation around propaganda and how information became a tool for state and corporate knowledge projects.
Thank you. All right, so just to address that first topic, I think perhaps it always has been. I don't know if we can go to a place where it wasn't. It was long before I was around, at any rate. Okay, so we had a great conversation in our group, really challenging and convivial and fascinating, a lot of fun. So, and we had a really nice lead-in to what we were doing from the exercise that we did as a group, right? So we kind of pulled out a couple of common elements from that group exercise around thinking about what propaganda is in terms of persuasive information that's presented with an agenda, right? Like a real intent to persuade. And so that led us into kind of asking about what some of the different definitions are of propaganda that exist out there, and we went over some of those in the group. We talked about examples from, and you can follow up with me if you want more info on these, examples from Philip Taylor, Jason Stanley, Edward Bernays. And we ended with kind of a challenge to the notion that propaganda is always necessarily a bad thing. Going from an essay from W.E.B. Du Bois from 1926 called Criteria of Negro Art. I'll just read you a small excerpt from this. He says, quote, "Whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda, but I do care when propaganda is confined to one side and the other side is stripped and silent." So that's a really interesting kind of provocation to say perhaps we can think about persuasive and mediated speech as being an instrument for social justice and not merely an exercise of state power. I'm going to have to refer to I don't have enough hands. I'm going to use the mic stand. Yes. Lo and behold, there's a mic stand here to be used. How wonderful. So, right? I know. Don't ask me to bust out my David Bowie dancing, because I will. Yeah. So this kind of led us into asking, is propaganda always necessarily a bad thing? And we reviewed, for example, Edward Bernays' perspective from the 1920s, where I'm always surprised when students pick up this ball and run with it. Edward Bernays, who was a publicist, kind of intervened in the Dewey-Lippmann debates by saying, perhaps propaganda is a good thing for democracy because we have an overwhelming amount of information, and if we can give people a simplified version, maybe that's better. This is generally understood to be problematic from a democratic perspective, but I have found some students are like, well, maybe he's got a point, right? So that's something that perhaps we have to contend with, the notion of simplified narratives being something that's attractive to people, right? And to think through with our students how that kind of challenges our democratic reasoning. On the topic of democratic reasoning, we also talked about the notion of propaganda as being something that incites the emotions, right? So thinking about what counts as not fair dealing or anti-democratic incitement of emotions towards anti-democratic ends, and how to separate that from the kind of moral outrage that goes along with seeing social injustice. We talked about agitprop versus propaganda, thinking about the difference between conveying ideas about how the world works versus exhorting people to take action. Brian Friedberg from Data and Society, who was my assistant for this session, raised the point of ACT UP and some of their campaigns during the 1990s as a really wonderful example of agitprop. We talked about where we've witnessed misinformation or propaganda in the past, and this was a really fascinating conversation to talk about. So there's the quote from the Supreme Court Justice about pornography, where he says, well, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And that's an interesting way to talk about propaganda, because often people have a sense of what counts as propagandistic, right? So we started talking about some of the examples of what we witnessed in the past and how we were able to know that those things were propaganda. One participant in our session mentioned ads for the U.S. armies, and how they both like kind of obscured some of the actualities of being a soldier. And also, thank you, and also conveyed a certain aesthetic that was recognizable to us as being propagandistic. We talked about how politicians use Twitter, and how what looks like an engagement with the people can also be an exercise of influence, right? Of gaining your, of kind of putting something before your followers that they can then act upon. And we talked about how we want to have room for a definition of propaganda that can not only allow us to talk about state actors and about foreign influences in our own democracy, but can also empower us to be critical of our own state when it takes actions that we think are unjust, right? So we want a working definition that's going to be able to encompass all of those things. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it in this session. This was a fantastic group and a wonderful session, and please come and find me and Brian if you'd like to talk to us more about these issues during the reception period. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Cleveland. It's great to be here again. So turn the mic off. Maybe I didn't. I hope you can still hear me. So what's interesting about the mimetic group is I think I might have undersold it to the point where it was like me, Matt, and Emily here. And so, but we had a really interesting talk about memes and sort of the ways in which sort of styles and ways of talking and ways of doing things become so predictable that they become eminently hackable. We talked a little bit about the idea of a TED Talk and how the TED Talk has a certain presentation style where people get really excited over time to tell you something that outrages you. And then they tell you how you're a good person for knowing about it. And then they say, buy my book, right? So we talked about why the form of things takes the form that it does and what might be persuasive about that. We also talked about some of these more scientific memes that travel around related to your background in medical libraries. Made me think about the vaccines and anti-vaxxer type memes and how health and public health is, I've read the studies, I've done the research. Public health is being affected by the way pop culture is talking about toxicity, right? And so we might say this comes just in the form of vaccines, but now it's coming in the form of the food we eat, the air quality that we have, and there's lots and lots of memes about toxicity. And then piggybacking on them are ads for things that can detoxify you. And so, but what's interesting about the form of a meme is that if it is presented in a very structured way, it can be very powerful as a medium. And we don't right now have any great answers, because one of the things that we were talking about, our conversation kind of ended on, was if you were to try to parody some of these memes to show how outrageous they are, what might happen. And what might happen is actually what Dana was talking about earlier, a kind of boomerang effect where you think you're saying one thing, but your audience doesn't understand the context. And Matt was talking about how right now we're entering into a moment where there are two court cases that are going to test the meaning of memes related to protests. So after the Unite the Right rally, which ended in horrible, horrible violence, two of the people that were organizers are being prosecuted. And part of the evidence in the cases against them are memes they shared online related to cars of peace which are the method of attack in Charlottesville obviously was with a car, and they had prior to that been sharing memes about that. As well, one of the defendants is saying, well, if you look at the memes, they're obviously meant to be funny, but only funny to a specific audience. And so we're going to see the notion of free speech tested on these grounds, and it's something that we're going to pay a lot of attention to at Data and Society and hopefully share back with you some of that research. And without further ado, Professor Acker, tell us the way in the metadata.
Okay. So our group got through one question, but it was really meaningful. So we started by introducing ourselves and giving examples of when we had ourselves shared fake news or misinformation. How many of us have accidentally shared misinformation or fake news? So there were two observations I had. The first one was, those of us who don't use social media don't share fake news. So that was interesting. And then the second one was a lot of us have been duped into sharing things based on our close relationships that these platforms make possible. So that was also interesting. When we think back about the community networks that we heard from our keynote this morning, I want to share things that you share. I may not want to read them before I do, but that's something we're thinking about. So we started by that, and then we started asking ourselves, what is metadata? And what is metadata? Yeah, data about data, okay? And so that's the most common definition. Data is something that's given to us in the world. I often ask my students, what is not metadata? Is everything metadata, or is one person's data another person's metadata? But we spent some time thinking about what kinds of metadata does social media create, and how is it different than other forms of metadata or standards that we've seen in our collections in the past. A few of our group members talked about how we've had sort of legacy organizations for about 200 years now, giving us ideas about how we standardize and organize, provide access to collections. But increasingly, the metadata that we're getting created by social media data collections in particular are being created and handed down by platform technologists and ad platforms, right, in particular. So that really changes the ways in which we understand our own user metadata. And that led us to this idea of thinking about contextual metadata. Eileen gave us a really interesting idea about how literary scholars, you can see a book, you can see its size, you can see its cover, and you can maybe know where it's from, what century it was written in, where it was published, and so on. You don't even have to open up the book to know where it's from. That's much harder to do with metadata and our own social media metadata that we create today. If it's given to us from our platforms, it's actually really, really hard technically and conceptually to move through. So we need a kind of data literacy if we're really going to make sense of these new collections. Robin also had a really fun, cool saying, which I will now be using, which is that when we think about preserving this context through future, paper's still kicking ass. It is, if we think about how we are going to preserve the contextual stories around these new data traces, we're going to need new ways of telling these stories, new ways of understanding them, new techniques, models, and methods. And so I think that was sort of a lot of what we got through. Did I miss anything else? Is there any other stuff you want to add? But yeah, it was an awesome discussion, and thank you. This idea of contextual metadata is really important. And yeah, it was a great discussion.
Great. So many ideas to think with now, right? Almost too much. Almost like, Joan, there's like 8 minutes left. How much more, like how further can you go? You were the first one here. You're going to be the last one to leave. Maybe not. I mean, let's be real. Like, I'm getting tired. But I want to say, and I think that what I want to end this this session on is thinking about, and I think that this is really important as we start to think about today as, the kind of germ of a network, the germ of an idea around what are the kinds of knowledge infrastructures we're going to need, right? Let's not centralize the things. Let's run many experiments. One of the things that I was inspired by the presentation on all of the different attempts to spot and drill down into fake news is we're not going to get there with some grand plan. It's going to take a lot of experiments, a lot of failures, a lot of hard tries, a lot of near misses for us to start to build an internet that isn't so tightly stitched to advertising, so tightly bound to both the gatekeepers that are losing their way, right? I'm very happy that everybody here wasn't sitting here being like, how do we save WAPO and the New York Times? They're going down with the ship. We got to change the way the internet works. We got to put them on the front page of Twitter, right? Because I attend a lot of journalism conferences, and they're like, gatekeeping is hard, man. We need to build better gates. And I'm like, no, decentralize all the things, right? Move them around, experiment with them, because ultimately we have these platforms and they've been great for getting us to talk to each other, but the web is still there. It's still pretty ugly. It still needs some work, but working across platforms, working across our networks, working across our experiments, I do believe that we can win. So I want to end today by asking everyone to stand up and just repeat after me. You can say it as softly as you want, but just say, I believe